Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui and welcome in everyone to today's Hoon, this week's Hoon, for the week to January 29 on the Kaka. Peter, lovely to see you.
Good to see you too, Bernard. But unfortunately, don't seem to be making you dinner this evening.
No, that'll be another day. So nice, the last one. I enjoyed the protein. It was fantastic. And how was your week? How did it go?
Kind of quiet, Bernard. I took some people out fishing the other day, and I was on the Waitemata, and I was and into the Hauraki Gulf, and I was quite surprised, but also impressed at the extent now of the protected area of the Hauraki Gulf, because there's a whole bunch of new areas where you can't fish. So I fished where you are allowed to fish, and of course didn't catch a bloody thing, which was slightly irritating. So I need some new lessons on soft baiting, I fear. But it's impressive, the scale of the protected areas in the Gulf now, and one can only hope it works. Somebody I know was just talking to me the other day about evidence about the DNA of snapper, proving that a huge percentage of the DNA of the snapper that's caught in the Hauraki Gulf originates from breeding inside the Goat Island Reserve. So these reserves do work, and
just imagine if the entire Gulf was a reserve, it wor be amazing.
Well, it would, but that would be slightly irritating for people who like to bring home, be bloody classic New Zealanders are in their fizz boats, for which Act has meant that they don't have to pay fuel duty now. It'd be slightly irritating for them. But
we need sea user charges, I think.
Possibly. God, you're such a socialist sometimes, and such a bloody control freak. I mean, it's okay for Sanfords to go out and get our snapper, but as long as we can't catch it ourselves, but we have to go and buy it in a shop.
Anything that burns petrol or diesel, road user charges on the sea. That's what we need. And you can only catch a fish if you're
but we have to teach a man how to fish, Bernard. But yeah, there are very good electric boats coming, and that's absolutely true. Just in case anybody is wondering, we will fix the chat later, but the show that's showing up on YouTube does say the 22nd, but it is in fact today's one. You are 29th. Watching the live show.
Great.
And Bernard, how's your week gone? You seem to be living in a combination at the moment of Waiheke and Europe.
Well, in my head, yes, because it really has been a week of just trying to keep on top of the latest news in the financial world, which I keep taking interest in. The price of gold rising $500 in 4 days. And
to another record all-time high, 5,500 now, is it, Bernard? Or is it just over $5,000?
Almost $5,500 US dollars. And $500. There was a time not that long ago when that was the entire cost of, of gold.
Yes.
And this is a momentous occasion, really, in the history of finance and global financial markets, where this is the sort of thing that only happens, once every century or so, where the world's reserve currency comes under attack or shifts or changes. There was a time when it was the British pound. There was a time when these currencies were directly connected to gold, and the price was set. We had Bretton Woods.
And sterling silver.
Sterling silver, that's right. And there was a time when under Bretton Woods, really, and it's still the case, the US dollar was the world's, not only reserve currency, but fiat currency, and can be printed at large. And you could argue we're getting to the final
So are you doing your economics soliloquy at the beginning of the show now instead of at the end of the show?
I'm giving people a sneak
preview, because I listened to your 5 minutes thing from ANZ this morning, and apart from the fact that you do it at about 4 a.m, I thought it was incredibly impressive. It sounds as though you've just, taken some MDMA or something as you started, and so you've got, you're super enthusiastic.
Don't be telling ANZ that.
Well, yeah, it's another initialism, of course, and it just was very professional, but also very informative. Now, should we bring into this at some point? Maybe even you can find somebody, because this must be doing a lot for cryptocurrencies, particularly for Bitcoin as well, because that's what we've got to connect in a sense. If the United States dollar is diminishing as a fiat currency, then it's going to go to the support is going to go to alternative instruments, right?
Do you trust Satoshi Nakamoto?
No, I do not.
Do you know who he is? Or she?
No. Well, I don't think it's the Australian chap who claimed to be Satoshi Nakamoto the other day, or a couple of years
ultimately,
ago now.
money, particularly the stuff that isn't hard and shiny and weighs a lot, is about trust, collective trust. And the world is losing collective trust in the creator of the world's reserve currency. And it's happening in front of our eyes in a way that none of us have seen in our lifetimes, and which usually only happens in the wake of some absolute catastrophe. It happened after the First World War, when effectively the pound lost its way as the world's reserve currency, and then there was a break with the gold connection. And eventually the next big change was Bretton Woods, and effectively America taking over the world because it won the Second World War. And so what's happening now?
So you really are doing the end of the show, the beginning of the show. No, I think converting the show was quite good. Now, we've got Catherine in the green room, but let me mention a couple of things on the media thing. Thomas Friedman, one of the great apologists for most of what Israel does, wrote today about the killing that we mentioned last week of the 3 journalists flying a Hamas-connected drone, allegedly, in Gaza. And Thomas Friedman comments that is how a nation and an army loses its soul.
He's onto it.
It's quite interesting coming from him, given the level of his commitment, but also I would argue as a frequent apologist for Israel. I think also interestingly, Bernard, New Zealand, just before, when we'll talk about this perhaps when we get into the domestic issues, but things we mentioned last week, this movement against the so-called bucket people who are generally identified as being of Chinese descent, who are in the going and finding mollusks and things. The New Zealand First has come out with a campaign against them. And linked it directly to immigration. So I think that's another kind of nasty edge to that story. And I want to talk to both Robert Patman and you a little bit later, when we have Robert Patman on the international section, about whether Winston Peters can really stay as foreign minister for the remainder of the coalition period if he's going to crap on the Indian Free Trade Agreement.
Yeah, great question. And we've discovered today that New Zealand decided to sign the Free Trade Agreement, even knowing that Winston Peters would oppose it. And so would New Zealand First, it's a hell of a risk. You're essentially signing off as a country, hoping that an opposition party decides to support it in Parliament.
That's right. It's and also your foreign minister. It's a very interesting thing. So what we've got climate shortly with Dr. Catherine Dyer. I want to ask her a question about a conspiracy that's going on, a conspiracy story from a conspiracist journalist of sorts, which you're resisting having on, but we're going to just slip in under the door if we can.
Good.
We're going to do international affairs with Professor Robert Patman, and for those of us who followed us before, Jonathan Lyons, the author and journalist from the United States, former colleague of mine and an expert on Iran, because the United States is sending what President Trump called Uncle Sam called an armada to the Gulf to confront Iran. Domestic news, Bernard's dying to talk more about the economy, and we've got
politics,
Judith Collins' appointment or withdrawal from resignation from Parliament, and now appointment. And I'd like to touch a little bit, Bernard, if we get to it, on the Trump comments about the bravery of NATO soldiers, which I think in this case includes New Zealand soldiers. Catherine.
Yes, Catherine, how are you?
How are you?
Kia ora. Good.
Great to see you today. It is damn hot here. It's damn hot everywhere, or damn wet, or both. And this week there's been plenty of news, fallout, information about the climate. And I wondered if we could start with some really interesting comments and some research by Manu Kadi, who is one of those really interesting and thoughtful people speaking from Tairawhiti about forestry, about land use, and in particular about nature-led solutions to our climate crisis. I wondered if you could talk a bit about what Manu's saying.
Yeah, he's been doing some really great work, including some a paper that got published quite recently, and it's probably worth going through what that paper says because it echoes a lot of the report. You know what has been said in reports after extreme weather events in the past. You know, like Cyclone Gabrielle and Cyclone Hale, and it seems like we keep doing research and we keep getting advice from these reports and it keeps getting ignored and then we get around to the next one and the same things happen again. And Tairawhiti is one of those regions that is hit hardest by these sort of things happening, so it's worth kind of looking at what they're talking about. I also got emailed by a guy who's working with a group called Mana Taiao Tairawhiti, and that is a grassroots organisation, so lots of people there who are concerned about these issues and trying to raise the profile of them. And on the organising committee for that group is Manukari and Salmon, Dayman Salmon. Also other names like Renee Raroa, who's from East Coast Exchange and Toha NZ. And so they're trying to get the spotlight more on these issues and get some more action from the government. But if I go back to some of the things that Manu Kari and his co-authors were saying in the report that they got, or the article that they got published recently, there's just this list of issues that come up after, I guess, every one of these events, and that is that these we have extreme weather events that are happening more frequently, that they have a particular impact on areas where there have been past poor land use decisions that go back decades and decades over time, and where there has been extraction in the past, and that it has left consequences, and those consequences have been visited onto local people, that over and over again it is local Māori and iwi and marae who pick up the pieces after these things. They are massively underfunded and they're not getting the training and the support that they need to be able to participate more and to be involved more with the broader civil defence organisations. That the impacts of all of these events tend to reinforce inequity. And so they fall hardest on people who have the least to start with, and that is often also Māori and in those areas. And the land use decisions around forestry in particular that are, we've all seen the stories about slash and the effects of that, but it's damaging other local businesses, other agricultural efforts, and is dangerous as well, that people have been injured and killed by those things. So that group that I mentioned earlier, they put out a press release yesterday and they had a hikoi today, trying to bring attention to some of that stuff. Yeah,
no, they're doing amazing work, and I wanted to make sure that this was given a bit more of a profile. I'll put links to Manu's research and his latest Substack in the show notes. And good to see Marty Sharp from Stuff also letting everyone know about this hikoi, because Tairawhiti starts from an incredibly painful base of poverty, basically, and it's it's a classic example of where climate change hurts the poorest the most and the hardest. And his work illustrates the subsidies that not only are being paid by the locals who are having to clean up the mess, look after the displaced, and to do it with no money, effectively give a subsidy to the rest of society. But at the same time, the foresters, the farmers who aren't paying the real costs of what they're doing to the rest of us. And, it is one of the facts of climate change that the costs of these disasters are surprisingly surprising to those people who, in theory, are supposed to be focused on climate change. And I'm talking here about the government, of course, which isn't including the true cost of these disasters in its accounts, in its funding plans, in its obsession with keeping the size of government under 30%. That is not going to be possible when we have a climate headed towards 3, maybe 4 degrees by the end of the century. And I think it's great the work they're doing. Now, the other thing I think that's interesting is, here's some. We'll finish this section on hope. Catherine, a couple of bits of news about electricity networks. Firstly, in New Zealand and then in Australia. What are we seeing in New Zealand in terms of how we could address the need to decarbonise, shift to renewable, and do it in the most affordable way?
Yeah, so I know you've been reporting on a report that just came out, prepared by Jacobs for the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority. And that report in particular, this is something I've been talking about for a long time, and I'm so happy to see this report come out. They are looking specifically at demand side flexibility. So rather than spending billions and billions of dollars on new infrastructure and new generation, we could actually spend less than a third of that money to manage demand and to shift peak demand into off-peak areas. And this report shows how you could do that, specifically where that demand could be shifted, for whose demand could be shifted. And they reckon that it could produce a 25% decrease in peak electricity, and that would avoid more than $3 billion worth of investment in generation and infrastructure. So that doesn't come at no cost. You still have to incentivise that shifting to happen, but it's less than a third of the cost. The other report we were looking at is one out of Australia. So they've recently just had a day where more than 50% of their electricity was from renewable sources. And one of the biggest things that's making a difference there, apart from rooftop solar, of course, is battery storage. And that those two things combined, solar and battery, really allow you to do a lot more distributed energy as well. And that in itself, it can really be of benefit in terms of, disaster resilience in some of these areas where these sort of extreme weather events are hitting. It can provide for local employment. There's often jobs associated with having better, stronger local supplies of energy. So those things combined, and also what happens when you have community energy, for instance, particularly around Marais, who are doing all this work that should be invested in locally there. So one of the benefits of that as well is that when people are producing their own energy locally, they're very aware of how much energy is being produced, at what price, and where it's going to, and they become very engaged in managing the demand side of it as well. So that means that you have less energy being consumed in the first place. So those sort of things combined can really have a massive impact in A, shifting our energy use, and B, reducing our overall energy use, so that we don't actually need to do all of that massive investment in new infrastructure and so on. So there's a lot of problem solving that can be done,
It's a great report, and it really opens your eyes to the possibilities of actually using less, but also using less in a peak sense. So it may actually mean more in a nominal sense, but if you can do it at a different time of the day, and this is where batteries play a huge role at the source of the demand, being able to shift it around without having to build a honking new power network. And it's so disappointing really to see the current government still focused on the supply side, and in particular the fossil fuel supply side, by looking to do its LNG import terminal, continuing to rely on overseas fossil fuels. If they'd had the sense to read, for example, that national security document from the UK about reducing your reliance on fossil fuel imports, they might actually see that it would be a much better investment to get hold of these damn cheap right now Chinese batteries and panels, and avoid having to import these shiploads of sometimes polluted fuels, to the extent that several times this year we've had to ration supply of jet fuel because we didn't get the right type from
Which
the
we
refinery.
perhaps wouldn't have had to do if we hadn't closed down our own refinery.
Exactly. That's another.
Which, as you
thing.
know, I disagreed with you about, but I was right and you were wrong. And I'm big and
other-
you're small.
Another thing I would point out, there's been some really great numbers put together by Robert McLaughlin, I think, from Massey University. So basically showing that our energy independence is declining over time. So even though we're, we've got some good work being done on new renewable energy that's coming into play, our energy independence is declining over time, and a lot of that is driven by our transport policies. And so if you keep building more roads and bringing in more cars, then that's more oil that you have to import. So that's part of the energy picture as well. And if you read that report from the National Security Assessment report, that reducing our reliance on those sort of imports is going to be really important in the future. And so getting, a bit more energy independence going would be a really good thing. And our transport policy is one place to look to achieve that.
Catherine,
So,
very swiftly, before you go, because we've got Jonathan Lyons and Robert in the Mount Maunganui landslide has caused an extraordinary upwelling of pretty nasty right-wing attacks on Maori, iwi, the local council, much of which seems to be justified in terms of the local council, and of course questions about the true impact of climate change. And I would, don't you roll your eyes at me. And I was quite struck by a chap that I think is a ludicrous conspiracist 99% of the time, Ian Wishart, who did a piece which is actually not, in a way, countered quite well some of the claims about the removal of trees and so on in Mount Maunganui, and explained that, in fact, it was pūtakawas that were removed from the relevant area because they had myrtle disease. But I just wonder, could you explain this dichotomy between, we say frequently that there are going to be or are more intense climate events, and that they're probably going to be more frequent, and yet not completely ridiculous people will say sometimes actually they're not in fact more frequent, but are they more intense? What is the fundamental data about frequency and intensity at the moment, please?
Luke Harrington, who's a climate scientist based at University of Waikato, put up on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago a list of 5 or 6 academic articles that basically prove the increased intensity and the increased frequency of extreme weather events in Aotearoa. So we can definitely link to those in the comments
Thank you.
Section afterwards. So there is absolutely real evidence that is happening. We talked a couple of weeks ago about the record ocean heat.
Yes, we did.
Content. 90% of the heat associated with climate change has gone into the oceans to date. And that extra heat puts a lot of extra energy and moisture into play when it comes to all of the weather that's happening. We have had a series of marine heat waves around Aotearoa over the last, over the last year, but in fact there's more and more of those all the time. And so, we are seeing more intense extreme weather events, and we can expect to see more of them. And we can also expect to see more of the landslides associated with them, because what happens a lot of times with landslides, yes, they are related to all sorts of other things as well, because all of the stuff is interconnected with biodiversity loss and land use choices that have been made over many, many decades in the past. So all of those things combine to increase the overall risks. But when you get extra heat, which dries out all of that, particularly, land that has a lot of clay content in it and so on. It dries it out and it develops these big cracks because it's dry, and then you get a big deluge that comes through like we did in the last few weeks, and all that water pours into those cracks. All of that land, that clay filled kind of soil, turns into this kind of slippery, mucky mess, and it all just slides away. And so there's all sorts of nature-based things that we ought to be doing, whether it's planting and just changing our land use practices. And that is what a lot of these people in Tairāwhiti are getting really upset about, is that they have worked really hard with the council and with local forestry and agriculture to create a plan for changing land use and for improving resilience of all of their slip-prone territory, and the government has refused to invest in it. And so, the things that need to be done are being done.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that succinct perspective. We've got a bit of an echo on the line, either from Robert or Jonathan. Is that possible? Oh, have you just done something, Jonathan? Is there an echo there? Anybody got their speakers on?
Sitting here quietly.
Excellent. All right. Well, can we solve that in post-production, Bernard?
Yeah. Let's.
Oh, we may have solved it by Catherine going. No, we haven't.
No.
Okay. What do you think it is? Just before we introduce.
I think it is. Let me just have a quick look here.
It's Robert, apparently, according to Simon.
Robert, would you be able to sign out and sign back in again with the option for no headphones, if there's a option for that? Cool, thank you. Brilliant.
Jonathan, thank you so much for coming. And just while Robert's going and coming back, we'll introduce you. Jonathan, it's great to see you. Terrific that you've come in at relatively short notice, as we would appear to be facing another crisis on Iran. You're a well-known author on Iran, long-standing follower of the country, and of course the former Reuters correspondent in Tehran. What's your immediate take on this idea? We have theoretically an armada on the way, and yet at the same time we've got the regime, the administration, the Islamic administration in Tehran saying it's actually ready to talk without conditions. It's the conditions that are the problem. What do you make of the Iranian administration's approach?
Well, I think before answering that, if I could, Peter, and thank you for the warm welcome. I think it's important to just take a step back and look at the Iranian context rather than the sort of global context.
Absolutely, yep.
And what I'm reminded of was my own personal experience in 1999, when as the Reuters bureau chief, I was covering the outbreak of student violence, student protests. A pro-reform newspaper had been closed. Students were angry. They were then attacked in their dormitory. One was killed officially. We think others were killed. It's unclear. Set off days of protest. And I want to contrast that with what's happening today, because at the time I was out in the streets reporting that the security forces were using live ammunition and tear gas. Categorically denied by the government. And about 10 days later, there was a big meeting. Khatami, then the reformist president, met with his constituency, which were the students, and denied that there was any use of force, contrasted the Iranian restraint with other societies and other countries who might use tanks and guns. And he basically turned his back on the student plea but what's important is not that. To me, what's important in the context of today is the degree to which they went to deny that violence was involved. Yeah. Now let's fast forward 25, 26 years. The violence is the point.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a huge difference and raises questions about what the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic really is. They're not trying to defend their system politically anymore. They're not trying to defend their system religiously, which, as I've said on your program before, would be a very difficult, complex problem, and we can go into that if people want to hear more. So what are they really saying? They're saying, we have the guns, you don't. End of story.
To their own people.
To their own people. And in the context of the Armada, this then raises a question: what change, whether it's externally driven, by US or other pressure or internally driven by protest, what is the change that could be expected to evolve? The civil society has been battered badly, not just this last 10 or 12 days, but the last few years. While there's a vibrant sort of alternative arts culture, there really isn't a political civil society. So who would step forward? The only likely candidates would be horrific to the very people who want to see a change. And that would be
So
most likely the
explain that a
Revolutionary
little
Guard.
bit, because I think I wondered, and I wanted, I think we're going to ask Robert to sort of focus on the unilateral aspect of the Trump approach to this, and you're the historian with the deep view of Iran. Is this a signal of the vulnerability of the regime, or in a way the opposite?
The use of force?
Yeah.
Well, as I say, it's an acknowledgement, perhaps not overtly, but to anyone paying attention, it's an acknowledgement that they have no choice. When we had a pro-reform movement, even though it was quite weak and disorganized, it gave voice to aspirations of a significant portion of the population. That population no longer has an institutional voice. They can't defend their republic religiously because Shia practice really doesn't have room for a political clerical system. So what are they saying? They're offering nothing. So it's a nihilist kind of society right now and if we want to look at American foreign policy intervention, we look at Venezuela. What happened there? Well, they decapitated the regime, but they didn't. They kept the system. If they decapitated the Iranian regime, i.e. threats against Ayatollah Khamenei were carried out, with whom would they be making a deal? That said, there are realists, there are people probably in the foreign ministry and other places that kind of see a path forward that would see Iran reintegrate into sort of global system, which is a very unrevolutionary approach.
So is there a sort of visible tension between reformists and non-reformist hardliners, as we've seen in the past, or not really? Is this kind of, as you say, the violence that's been deployed? Is this their way of, it's the only response that they can rationally have because they're the only alternative?
Right, and they don't have any other answer. I think that's what I was trying to say, that what would they offer? And to whom would they make this offer? So we're really at a dead end as far as, I think it's a tragedy. I think Iran has so much talent, so much creativity, so much of an educated populace, and yet there's really a dead end. I mean, I don't see a way out, and foreign intervention will just release these same forces in an exponential way, I suspect.
Jonathan, what sort of options does Trump have with his armada? He talks a lot, but what could he do, and how might that unleash these even darker forces inside Iran?
Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, I defer to some of the other guests. I think I'm not really someone who studies U.S. military intervention policy. I'm more interested in just the domestic Iranian side. But I can take a flyer and say, if we look back at the 12 days of Israeli and U.S. bombing, what did it do? It unleashed a very real trend in Iranian culture, which is a nationalism and a rallying around the system. Now, a lot has transpired since then with the really horrific violence. I mean, we talked about the violence, but I mean, it seems to be not only violence is the point, but violence for violence's sake. If we listen to some of the medical testimony from some of the medical personnel, people being shot in the head, blindings, disfigurements, sexual violence. I mean, it's really incredible. And the regime is making no attempt really to hide that. They've acknowledged how many people died, whereas 26 years ago it was taboo. So much so that a long series of events that led to me and Reuters being effectively expelled from the Islamic Republic, and by the way, I remain persona non grata, began with my reporting about student deaths when that just plain did not happen.
Yeah. Jonathan, thank you. Let me just bring in Robert on this as well. Robert, we've got this supposed armada going. It's a week since we had the creation of the Board of Peace. It's 3 weeks, I think, since the United States did a surgical invasion of Venezuela, clearly with the cooperation of people within the Venezuelan administration. What do you make of this extraordinary rise of unilateralism? Or is it an extraordinary rise of unilateralism or not?
I think all US presidents, particularly in the post-Cold War era, have resorted to unilateralism at certain points. But what I think is different about the second Trump administration, even the first Trump administration, is that the president doesn't really like, he's not really comfortable with multilateral efforts involving the United States unless it's working as he would see it in the interests of America first. And so he's probably got a greater tendency to seek out the use of unilateral power. Unilateralism has a poor track record in the post-Cold War era, which is often overlooked by many observers. We know what really happened regarding the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003. That was a US-led. I know there were coalition partners, but it was essentially a unilateral US-led coalition of the willing intervention with disastrous strategic and political consequences, not least of which was the inflation of Iran in the region as a downstream effect. But just reflecting on what Jonathan said, and which I wholeheartedly agree with, I think the big danger for the Trump administration is that it could actually not only have a rally around the flag effect, but it could actually undercut the protests in Iran, because the narrative from the beginning by the regime in Tehran has been that all the protesters are agents of Israel and the United States. And by aggressively intervening in Iran, I think that would sort of bolster the narrative of the regime and discredit the opposition, which is the very thing which the Trump administration, and I think by extension Israel, says they don't want. So the other thing that I found interesting, another aspect which could have unintended consequences about any US intervention in Iran, is the consequences for Israel. The regime have pointed out, and I'm sure Jonathan's much more aware of this than I am, but it did strike me as interesting that the regime in Iran has said that any US strike against Iran will result in immediate retaliation against Tel Aviv. And Jonathan referred to, quite rightly, to the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. Although there were many more casualties in Iran than Israel, the infrastructure damage inflicted by Iran during that 12-day war, I think, surprised many Israelis. And I think there's a fair amount of nervousness in Tel Aviv at the moment about the prospect of America intervening and prompting that sort of retaliation.
Yeah, it has been said, I think, hasn't it, Jonathan, that and Robert, that Israel may have asked, or Benjamin Netanyahu may have asked Trump to postpone action that might have occurred earlier, but also that the fact that Qatar and the Gulf states did not wish it to go ahead, and certainly not from the Al Udeid air base in Qatar. What do you make of those sort of strategic machinations about US allies in the Gulf, and also, of course, they're Sunni rather than the Shia Republican in Iran, but of course have significant Shia minorities in several of them as well. What do you make of it, Jonathan? That chemistry.
Well, it's a tough one because in a way those countries benefit from the status quo, which is Iran is basically crippled economically, constrained politically, it's hemmed in militarily. So it would be to their benefit, one would think, at least in the medium term, to do nothing. So it's a tough one. But I just want to come back to something Robert said, because again,
Please.
from the historical perspective, Madeleine Albright, when she was Secretary of State, sent a congratulatory telegram to reform forces who had done well in some parliamentary elections, and that was the beginning of the end of that movement, because right away there was the evidence that these were U.S. stooges and they weren't really representing the will of the Iranian people. So we have seen this movie a couple times. We'll probably see it again. But to get to the question of what could they actually do, I mean, I guess they could take out some of the military installations. They're chipping away at the borders. They could perhaps try to incite the Arab minority in some of the provinces, but they're really limited in what they can do, I think. I mean, it's the paradox of power. I'm sure Robert can tell us more about that. But they've got these oversized weapons that are blunt instruments. They want us to believe in surgical strike, but these are not surgical strike machines that are aiming towards Iran at the moment. I think it's also worth, if I could just intervene, one other
Sure,
thing.
of course, please.
Out of the mouths of babes, Secretary of State Rubio was asked what happens next. He says, we have no idea who would take over. I'm sure he'll be, reined in by the White House, but, he actually said something
True.
insightful. Wow, from the Trump administration. Again, from a broader standpoint, there is no coherence to this administration's approach to these problems. They just kind of winging it, and they have the military, economic, and seemingly political power to do what it is they want to do right now without much constraint. But I don't know that there's anybody thinking it through.
Jonathan, I'm curious about some of the dynamics inside Iran with a very educated workforce who have a long history of, public protest and eventually the public's will becoming the government, or at least that seemed the way it looked in the late 70s, when the very unpopular Shah was essentially overthrown from the streets, obviously with the involvement of the clerics. But now that you have the clerics killing thousands and thousands of people, and clearly it's a brutal suppression of the public, and particularly the educated young, how does this end? I mean, where do these educated people who are now feeling completely brutalized and shut out, what do they do? Do they all leave? Is there anything more they can do now that they can see that there's nothing that the bosses, if you like, won't do?
I think there's several things that they can and they do. One is an internal sort of retreat inside subcultures, artistic cultures, music cultures. Immigration. I live in Western Canada off the coast of Vancouver. I go to Vancouver once a week. I hear more Persian there than I've heard since I left Tehran. They're doing very well. Of course, many of them have been here for decades, if not longer. What can they do? Well, let's step back a little. Khomeini hit the Western consciousness like a bomb, right? The 1970s, but that's not really. That just shows how little we really knew about what was going on in Iran. There was many, many years of careful activation of political and religious and economic networks in the bazaar. He wrote pamphlets. He was funded in Iraq by rich Iranians, building up networks. And when the Shah was overthrown from the street, sort of like Lenin and Lenin's experience in early what became the Soviet Union, he was the man with the plan and the determination, and he filled a vacuum. I know from reporting I did for my first book, which was about Iran and its political culture, that he never expected in his lifetime to see the evolution of this clerical system of which he was pushing for. He thought it was a decades, maybe centuries long process. So we ignore what's going on because we don't really know. And I have to confess that I don't really know. As I said, I'm not allowed in
Jesus
the
Christ,
country.
that's not what we do on podcast, Jonathan. We just talk bollocks and try and give the impression we know what we're talking about.
You know, I
That'll
I
get
can
you
do that
nowhere.
with the best of them, but I'm sort of at a point in my life where I just don't do that. I don't feel like I need to, because I mean, all joking aside, it's an opaque system. But I want to highlight one of my favorite subjects when we come to Iran, and that is clerical opposition to the Islamic Republic.
Yeah.
And I mentioned this before, and I'll go into quick detail. In Shia traditional jurisprudence and theology, political power corrupts, and corrupts absolutely. You do not have a cleric running a government. This is an abomination. The extent of traditional Shia participation in government was only in times of crisis, such as the Tobacco Rebellion against the Brits and the British concession, oil politics. You come out of the seminaries, you set things straight, you fix the problem, and then you go back to your religious life and you pay no attention and you want nothing to do with politics. So Khomeini was a religious radical more than he was a political radical. And there's a big, sizable, serious contingent of clerics in the seminaries, in the religious theology ecosystem that do not accept the Islamic Republic as legitimate.
What an
The flip side
interesting-
of that is that they're quietist.
Yeah.
So
What's
a quietist to do?
Well, that's exactly why we have you on, because that is
That's
so
a fascinating
insightful.
insight, yeah.
And I love that title of your book, or both of them, both of the ones about Iran. Just let me ask you: the Shah's son has cropped up from time to time, and of course the Shah was installed after the Mossadegh coup, the US and British-led BP, if you like, coup of 1953, I think it was. What are we to make of the Shah's son, his credibility, if any, and the role of that family going forward?
I'd say minimal. The little reporting I've seen, and again, I don't have access directly, seems to suggest that he's most popular among people who were not born then, who did not know his father, did not know the Pahlavi regime and its repression of many religious, social, and civic organizations and movements and democratic tendencies. So, it's a name, but again, doesn't it illustrate the point that I tried to make at the outset, that there is no civil society figures. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to conjure up something from this mythical past. Surely things were better then.
Yeah, well, he did have a fantastic vintage classic car collection, including, I think, possibly the first Lamborghini Miura. Now, on that note, let me just move back to Robert, so we don't waste all of his afternoon. Robert, we had a conversation about something slightly different the other day, which was, and I don't mean to be sort of bogus in bringing this back to New Zealand, but part of what we talked about was New Zealand's readiness to participate in anything or support an initiative like this when it hasn't gone through the UN. And again, this is another one of those things that's, so far at least, utterly bypassed the UN. What do you make of that, and could you put it into a New Zealand context for us, please?
Well, I think New Zealand should be quietly or even publicly advising the United States not to play into the hands of the clerical regime, the repressive clerical regime in Tehran, by acting unilaterally in relation to events there. It's all very well Mr. Trump saying help is on the way, but for the reasons that both Jonathan and I have intimated, US intervention will probably have the opposite effect of what is intended, and could empower the regime and play, the rally round the flag thing. So I think that New Zealand should be saying to the United States, look, if you really want to help the protesters and the victims of this regime, use your weight on the Security Council. And by the way, the US has more weight on the UN Security Council than anyone else, to take the regime to task for what seems like even many thousands of people have been killed brutally in the recent times by this regime. Of course, I don't think the Trump administration has the inclination to do that. It holds the UN with barely veiled contempt. And Mr. Netanyahu certainly wouldn't welcome the United States standing up for the human rights of Iranians. But the point I would like to make is that I think New Zealand should be, as a small country with some influence, not too much, but some, echoing Mark Carney's position that actually middle powers and small powers should be developing a voice on precisely these issues. The United States hasn't got a stellar track record when it comes to regime change in other countries. It's often counterproductive. And by the way, there are signs that things are unraveling in Venezuela already. So, other countries do need to start making their preferences known. And I think New Zealand shouldn't be, just sitting on the sidelines waiting for the United States to fix the situation. I don't have too much confidence that the United States can fix the situation in Iran. And I think the Iranians, I mean, Jonathan's obviously got much more expertise than I have on Iran, and I fully take on board his point that there's a lack of leadership, civilian leadership in waiting to take over from this repressive regime. Fair point. But on the other hand, we should also not have any illusions that external actors can do the job for the Iranians. And I think one of the lessons of history is that, and Iraq underlined this point, and I think America's experience in removing Mossadegh in 1953 echoes this point, is that ultimately most Iranians, I think, would prefer that United States support was not, how should I put it, designed to rearrange the furniture and smuggle in the return of the Shah, but actually help them in the struggle against this regime, rather than taking actions which empower the regime against the protesters.
And Bernard, you wanted to ask Robert about the Board of Peace, and then I'll come back to close with Jonathan in a moment.
Yes, I've been gobsmacked this week, Robert, by the New Zealand government's apparent consideration of the Donald Trump offer to join his Board of Peace, and not the least of which, because it would cost us $1.5 billion to join it. And everyone else who we consider sensible in the world has said no. And I cannot understand why we're even dilly-dallying with this damn thing. Sorry
Yeah, I mean, I think they should have rejected it out of hand. But it may be to do with the coalition politics. It's the three parties that make up this coalition. It's no secret that the two minor parties share the anti-woke agenda of Mr. Trump. And certainly in the case of ACT, I think largely share his view of the Middle East. So, that may have everything to do with what I call is a measured approach, saying, oh, well, let's look into this. But, the government...
Is that another word for spineless? Sorry.
Possibly, but they've been looking into AUKUS for several years, haven't they? And we haven't got a decision out of that. It may be a sort of, a sort of a scenario where it's a non-decision, I think. I don't think the government is actually going to do this. Let's be quite clear. We've got an election year in New Zealand. They would be making themselves very politically vulnerable if they paid $1.5 billion to be on a board with Putin, Netanyahu, both of whom are wanted by the ICC, and Mr. Trump, who's not exactly particularly popular in New Zealand. So it seems to me what we're getting here is a non-decision.
Jonathan, let me ask you that classic question. You were nodding a little bit about the Board of Peace. You're welcome to indulge us on that one. What haven't we asked you that we should have to help us understand Iran? And can you recommend any sources of real-time information from Iran that you look to know as much as one can?
Wow. I'm not usually speechless, but I try to read the main sort of dailies and the wire services, and then sort of work through backwards. It's always been sort of technique that I use. There are a lot of sites. There's some independent reporting. There's a lot of good human rights work online, and we're getting some horrific figures.
And is that HRW, Human Rights
Yeah,
Watch,
that's quite good.
others?
Yeah, those are quite useful. But again, it's with the internet blackout. I think once that is lifted in some way, a lot more footage will start sneaking out. what I think we need to just keep focusing on our best attempt to understand and penetrate the dynamics of Iran as a normal country
Yeah.
with normal problems, with normal aspirations, with a highly educated population, um, and not treat it like some sort of freak show because it's so foreign to us. The notice of clerical rule and the rules on covering women, and these things are side stories
Yep.
in my view, and they get in the way of what should be rational analysis that we might apply to another third
Thank you.
country.
And which of your books do you recommend our audience takes a look at? The House of Wisdom, or the one that I love, Islam Through Western Eyes: From the Crusades to the War on Terrorism?
Oh, thank you. Yes, I think the House of Wisdom is a fun book. It really doesn't touch on Iran or anything like that or anything contemporary. It tries to show how Western culture owes a huge debt to Islamic philosophy and science from the 8th, ninth, 10th centuries. But Islam Through Western Eyes is an attempt to explain a lot of the things we see in contemporary relations between the West
Yeah,
and
thank you
the
very much.
Islamic world, such as the treatment of women, the monopoly on violence, anti-scientific, anti-modernity. So yes, I would humbly suggest that that's a good place to start.
Great. And let's remember why we love that title. It's because there's another wonderful book called The Crusades Through Arab Eyes, which I keep recommending to people, particularly people in Christchurch, where they have a rugby league team called the Crusaders, who literally come onto the stage and on horses with St. George's crosses and armour. Thank you so much, Jonathan Lyons. Really appreciate you coming on, and I know it's getting late over there. We do appreciate it. And Robert, as always, you're a lovely chap, and thank you so much for coming on.
Well,
Thank you,
Pleasure to
Jonathan
be
and
here.
Robert.
Good to see you
And
all.
Cheers.
Bernard,
And
let me what?
we've just put your Amazon links into the
Excellent.
chat for everyone to look at.
Oh, thank
Good.
you.
And Bernard, so we've deliberately let the international section go quite a lot longer. Let me just say a couple of things to Stephen Lennon, I think it is, and somebody called Chill Pill. I haven't blocked you yet, but if you think you can find nearly half an hour of discussion with genuine, highly knowledgeable people in a calm environment, whether it's Robert Patman or Jonathan Lyons, then by all means look at that podcast on YouTube and don't bother coming here. You heard at the very beginning of the show that we did address Gaza, about journalists, not about Israel. We have no particular obsession about Israel. So really, I think that somebody like Jonathan Lyons, and also Stephen, the thing about Reuters, just go to hell, really. But you've got really good expertise there. Take advantage of it. I'm the only one who looks at the comments, but you're lucky you haven't been blocked, both of you, because you're pretty offensive and insidious. Bernard, what's happening domestically?
Well, domestically, I'll be turning off the comments on YouTube, and going back to putting it in places where only paying subscribers can comment, and that's the guts of it. I'm over the internet, to be frank, about how it's being used.
No, I don't. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I will not have people who haven't paid me money tell us what to do or not to do. It's a very effective way to have civil conversations, to essentially force those people who have views to take the time and effort to pay to be part of a community, and those who haven't will not be part of the community.
Great. Well, Stephen's just said he doesn't care, so let me just block him. He can fuck off.
Good.
Now, Bernard, shall we just talk briefly about domestic news?
Yes, well, it's been a big week economically, both here and globally. We talked at the early part of the show about the US dollar dramas. Now, that meant the New Zealand dollar's gone over 60 US cents. And also this week, we've had fresh news showing that the apparent green shoots from November, December may have burned off, with numbers showing that retail sales in December were relatively weak. We also got Real Estate Institute data on the housing market, which slowed down again. And it's very clear now, with a couple of the bank economists halving their house price inflation forecasts, that even if we do get a recovery with GDP growth of 2 to 3% in this election year, it's not being felt either by those people who are renting and working because their a real disposable income after they've paid their rent and power and food and petrol bills is smaller. Typically, and has been for the last couple of years. And then for those people who own assets in New Zealand, and that means overwhelmingly housing, remember that our housing market is worth nearly 4 times our GDP and is worth 16 times the value of our stock market. So unlike in the States where the stock market's rise and fall actually matters, here it doesn't. The only thing that matters is house prices. And so when house prices go nowhere in New Zealand, those people who are in a position to spend don't spend. And that's what you get with an asset-based economy, not one that's based on actual wages and production. It's based on what people think about the value of their assets and whether or not they can consume those assets and whether they want to. Remember, a lot of people have a lot of money in assets and can't consume the lot. We're in this Scrooge McDuck world where piles of gold, literally gold coins, are in a swimming pool and Scrooge McDuck is trying to swim around. No money.
I loved Scrooge McDuck, I must admit. I must have been a young capitalist. Yeah.
Yeah. And that money is not being liberated into the economy to circulate as wages and income and all of those things. And it's the fundamental problem, as identified by Piketty and the rest, that the more concentrated wealth becomes at the top, the more this cycle of redistribution upwards and piling up of cash into assets that don't do anything becomes a problem. And this week we saw the explosion of the value of gold, really a function of people's... everyone can see this is happening and they know that nothing's being done about it. So they look at the ultimate conclusion of it, particularly when you have a politician like Donald Trump looking to get control of the money printing levers in the United States.
Excellent. So let me ask you, I think we're going to run out of time in a minute because we did allow this to go on, the international section to go on. You talked about something really interesting, and I hadn't quite heard it phrased this way in your piece this morning with the ANZ podcast. You talked about the debasement trade. What's that?
So this is where people who think that Donald Trump is going to get control of the Fed, he's going to force the Fed to cut interest rates to virtually nothing, fire up inflation, and inflation is the thing that will reduce the value of your assets in US dollars. So let's say, for example, you decide, as most very rich people have, to put their money into US treasuries or to US treasury bills, with the assumption that the US government will protect over time the value of the US dollar and make sure that they get repaid. That's why they put their money into the US Treasury. They're essentially betting that whoever is in control of the nuclear aircraft carriers will be in a position to repay them when time comes. Donald Trump has said things like, I might swap out these US Treasuries for some sort of crypto coin, a Donald Trump coin, for example. Or maybe I decide not to pay you interest because we can't afford it at the moment. Or I allow very, very high inflation, higher than the returns you get from your treasuries, effectively what's called fiscal dominance or financial repression, to essentially debase the value of your savings. And remember, US treasuries are the main place where the world's rich put those savings. They're getting nervous and they want to put it somewhere else, to the point where we even have a debate in Germany at the moment amongst the Bundesbank about whether they send someone to the United States to physically take their gold. And about a third of Germany's gold is stored in the US. I'm guessing a bunch of it in Fort Knox. To bring it back physically to Germany, just in case the United States decides to hijack it or do what the United States has done with Russia's assets, ironically. So this is the debasement trade, and it's potentially explosive. And so far, they've managed to keep a lid on it to the point where Donald Trump said yesterday, I'm not worried about the US dollar falling.
Which actually seemed to be a reinforcement of the debasement trade.
He's saying, I'm going to debase you. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
And Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, had to come out in desperation and say, oh, no, we like a strong dollar policy and we're not going to, intervene.
Yeah. Speaking of one of the great lickspittles. Speaking of one of the great lickspittles is Besant. Yeah,
Scott Bessent, yeah.
Scott Besant.
So the reason we should watch this because obviously if the US dollar collapses in some way, that means the New Zealand dollar increases. And if the US dollar were to collapse and to lose its reserve currency status, I'm not sure that's a sure thing yet, but it's looking really ugly. Then that completely destabilizes the fundamental glue and the tools that run our global society. If the US dollar is not there, we do not have the globalization that we've come to rely on.
Excellent. So let me rather than have a skateboard note, let me just close with two things. One is a quick poll of our audience, which we won't be able to do if you cut them off. Is Donald Trump A, Scrooge McDuck, B, the Penguin from the original TV series of Batman, who was played by Burgess Meredith, and I always found him absolutely insidious, especially given his use of a penguin in the Greenland memes. Or
wasn't he the one with the
cigar?
Cigarette holder?
Yeah, absolutely. Or is he the Joker, which was Cesar Romero, who I have to admit, I probably said this before, that the kind of grin that Joe Biden always did reminded me of both the Joker and Cesar Romero as the Joker. So which of those is he? Scrooge, the Penguin, or the Joker? Quickly. And then I guess I was going to do a skateboarding dog, and I found a moderately witty one. But shall we just all agree? And our friend Patrick Smelly did quite a good job of this online, just in his Facebook feed. If one extends, and I think one can, the Trump comments about the bravery of NATO troops who were just behind the front lines to people like Willie Appiata. Have we had a New Zealand politician other than Chris Hipkins? Have we had anybody in the government come out about that? They've kept themselves hiding under the duvet again, haven't they?
It is absolutely extraordinary that our leaders, and I include in this Christopher Luxon and Winston Peters, do not have the spine to speak up and support soldiers who fought in Afghanistan and in other places with American troops over many decades, to do, as we saw even with Keir Starmer, to push back and say no. And if you're looking for someone in our sphere, our mates, if you like, our fathers and grandfathers fought with the Canadian troops. And Canada has stepped up and said no. And I wish to goodness that our leaders that we elected did the same.
So we close it there. We have more votes for the Penguin than anything else. We have somebody saying, don't make Trump even amusing. And of course, our friend Chilpil, who I think we've met under other guises in the past, says Trump is the greatest of all time. So and I'm pretty sure that's because of Trump's support for Israel. So yeah, we know where you come from, but that's all right. We're a broad church. Yeah, despite being atheists, we're a broad church. I think you're an atheist, Bernard. Is that right?
We will soon be only collecting. We will.
I'll be going around with a
church.
silver. Yeah. If you hand over the readies. All right, but all right. Thank you so much, Bernard, and thank you everybody. And I hope you appreciated those guests. Jonathan really does know his stuff, and
Absolutely.
He's a lovely bloke. And yes, he did do work for Reuters, so
as I did,
as did I. So anyway,
thank you
See
very
you
much,
later.
everyone. Ka kite anō. We'll see you all next week. Bye bye.
Thanks very much.